Hello, I'm Dustin Kaufman, and the topic for this informative audio recording is the article titled Building Power, Italy's Colonial Architecture and Urbanism, 1923 to 1940, by Mia Fuller. The primary focus of this article is on the spatial organization of bodies and built forms in two of Italy's colonies, Libya and Ethiopia, from 1923 to 1940. This article then examines how Italian colonialism changed throughout this time period. For the purposes of this article, the author, Fuller, breaks the Italian periods of colonialism into three sections. The first of these sections, 1923 to 1928, includes the Italian focus, which was primarily on archaeology, geography, and architectural history as they related to colonial enterprise. This included Italian examination of already existing buildings in Libya and also the construction of new, more modern-looking buildings. The second time period, 1929 to 1936, included the shift to colonial architecture, which emerged as the dominant concern. However, at the end of this section of time, the focus shifted to a discourse on strict planning of colonial cities. And the third and final section, which Mia Fuller focuses in on, is 1937 to 1940, in which questions of urbanism in the colonial sphere became more pronounced as the strict planning of colonial towns in Ethiopia continued. Now, to provide a little bit of background information as an introduction into this topic, I'm going to delve a little bit more in depth into Libya and Ethiopia very briefly. In Libya, the colonial focus held by the Italians was to develop the architecture to bring it into modernity. This was supposed to demonstrate to the rest of Europe that Italy was a great colonial powerhouse too. Libya was seen as a space for modern expansion. Italy made early claims for Libya on the grounds that the area of Libya had originally been under Roman rule, and so it was only fitting that it would return to Italian rule, or so they said. It is important to note that Libya, during the Roman Empire, was abundant with crops, trees, water, and other forms of riches. In the early 20th century, however, it was mostly a desert. Oddly enough, the Italians blamed this environmental shift on the lazy occupants of Libya. When it comes to Ethiopia, however, the focus was much different. Italy designed and redesigned whole cities with the main intent being to control, regulate, and enforce Italian planning onto the native populations. Whereas in Libya, the focus of Italian occupation was to show their prowess to the rest of Europe through architectural design, in Ethiopia, the focus was to exercise Italian dominion over the natives. When it comes to the conquest for Ethiopia, Italy did not have an elaborate claim to Ethiopia like it did with Libya. Instead, violence, racism, and nationalism were on the rise in Italy alongside fascism, and so the conquest for Ethiopia was conducted simply for Italian expansion and also was heavily supported by the Italian public. From here, we will now turn our focus to the first of the time periods which Fuller examined, 1923 to 1928.
The first section of this reading covered 1923 to 1928 architecture, archaeology, and geography. Architecture training in Italian universities wasn't available on its own until 1920, and the major theme was to develop a distinct Italian colonial architecture. This was significant because Italian architecture would now be applied in real life as opposed to only in the academic setting. And outside of its immediate purpose in the colonies, Italian architecture, especially in Libya, brought hope to Italy's returning to dominance in the eyes of Europe. The architect's main goal was to instill Italy's new identity as a colonizing power. The growing interest in colonial Libya could be attributed to the study of ancient forms of architecture because it revealed consistent traces of Roman influence. Italians saw this as an indicator that the culture of Libya had always been Roman, and therefore Italian, and the colonization of Libya was just returning to its past condition. This helped to justify Italy's colonization of Libya. Geographers wanted to participate in the establishment of dominance into the colony by knowledge of economic, political, and physical conditions, and their ultimate goal was to make the best use of resources that were available to the colony. The knowledge of the territory and the resources in it was a way that the Italian colonizers exercised their power.
The section of the article on 1929 to 1936 discussing colonial buildings talked about architects' journals that were being sent back to Italy for the public to see. These journals had very little information or background on the buildings pictured in them. The buildings featured were mostly public spaces, such as monuments, churches, and government buildings. This is likely because these were the buildings that were designed with more classical features. These buildings, if put in Italy, would likely not stand out in Italian society at the time. The lack of homes in the journals did not mean housing was not important to the culture or living style in the colonies. It just simply meant it was not interesting to the readers back home. The governor's residence in Benghazi was very classical, but it was really the only classical home in Libya. Private homes were something that architects in Italian colonies could play with and find the most modern designs by crossing classical with indigenous designs. In one journal, an architect commented that he was going for neither classical or indigenous. Rather, the goal was modern. Other designers in Tripoli said that the only plan they had for their homes was functionality. In a very hot climate, homes just simply had to be something a person could take refuge in. This same mentality for home building also crossed over to hotels, which was another popular feature of Italian colonial city designs.
So now looking into the second half of this era here, we'll be talking about the influence that Italian architecture had on the culture of their African colonies. And looking into this, one of the main themes here is looking at how the Italian architects wanted to keep their themes of romance and modernism and local forms as a source of inspiration for a measure of comparison of the distinctions between the Mediterranean and the classical Roman and African styles. There was a certain level of respect between the Italian architects and the Libyan architects that were working in this period, and the Italians actually derived a lot of their buildings and the way that they set up their towns and civilizations from the way that the Libyans were continually structuring their civilizations before the Italians arrived. It's also the fact that the architects that arrived in Libya at this time were looking at how the Roman Empire in the past had actually influenced the way that Libyans were constructing things, and they could actually see Roman in Italian influence in the architecture when they arrived, and only looked to further that and build on that as they went through and continued to construct and build all of their architecture in Libya. One of the main issues that the Italians had with the Libyan architecture, however, was they viewed it as somewhat primitive and local rather than the Italian style of modernism and romanticism that they were looking for. So they decided to bring in further examples of Italian architecture and classical Italian architecture in order to implicitly create a new Italian identity and a modern character within the Libyan architecture. Moving throughout the time period, it didn't happen until about 1936 with the conquest of Ethiopia that Italy really started to take off with their architectural prowess and decided to integrate more and more of their own elements into the architecture, and it really just took off. Rather than some of the other colonial powers influencing architecture in Africa during this time, Italy was more critical after the conquest of Ethiopia and decided that the elements of former Libyan and Ethiopian architecture within the civilizations was not up to scratch with what the Italians really wanted. Thus, they decided to change all of these elements and build everything in the Roman style. And you can see that through some of the images from this article of the churches that look exactly like some of the churches in Rome. And the buildings have the obviously distinctly Roman style, the Italian Mediterranean style with the white walls and the large open archways, and how that in comparison to the thatched roofs and lack of brick basically in Libya and Ethiopia really just shows the impact that the Italian architects had on this area during this time.
The next section of this article was 1937 to 1940 Colonial Urbanism. So starting in 1937, there were major plans for quote-unquote new cities of Ethiopia, and the major concern being to control inhabitants and movement of traffic, as well as construction of buildings following a systematic plan. The ruling guideline for planning was race in the cities in Ethiopia, more specifically separation of blacks from whites. As the section continues to go on, there's a lot of talk of planning focusing on making it the most convenient for the Italians and Europeans and not giving as much thought to the convenience of the natives already in these cities. It then goes on to talk about how space and huge landforms being built up to express the Italian power and their presence in the new Ethiopian cities. And the Italians were no longer trying to just control the Ethiopians and the natives here, but rather to make sure the habitat of this native population was pre-inhabited by Italian power. So example of this was new Italian buildings were being inserted where previous ruling powers were. And planning was being actually a little more detailed for those living in the city that weren't white. Example of this was manipulation of landscape. So when they were segregating the blacks and whites, they were putting up barriers to separate them. And they would do this by using vegetation, what they would call a green barrier, and then water and riverbeds as like a natural barrier between the blacks and whites. As this section continues to go on, there was a focus more of differentiating between the Ethiopian cities and the cities in Libya. So the Ethiopian cities had more urbanistic approach. They did not put together the cities in Ethiopia to be as modern, but rather to be really dominant on the ground and displaying Italian power. So this was a little different from Libya, which was more focused on being kind of modern and classical and really Latin in spirit. Section then goes on to say that the Italian architect could really only fully practice colonial architecture for Ethiopia because it had been acquired without justification, unlike Libya where they were justifying that it was a historical right and like their heritage allowed them to take over that nation. And then the planning for Ethiopia was more of a shift from modern and regulation and classical to one of more a fastest venue of monumentality and articulation of space and power in Ethiopia, and really demonstrating Italian power and prestige. And at the end of the section of this article, you see kind of the counterpart to this vast scale of Italian power, where in 1940 it talks more about urbanism appearing as like a concern with urban living in these Italian homes of Ethiopian cities, and talking more about interior decoration becoming a big market in Italy and in its colonies. And that concluded this section of the article.